Is the Antichrist going to be Jewish or is he going to be Gentile? Now, I can't say for sure, but I can give you my opinion and I will show you the reason why I believe what I believe. But just understand that this is up for debate. There's people who see it both ways, and I think both sides, there's good, solid, born again believers on both sides of it. So always remember that. I often say that I can't wait to get to heaven to find out how wrong I've been. And so that allows for a little bit of grace to be mixed in there. But in Genesis chapter 10, verse 8, we're introduced to a guy named Nimrod. And with this chapter, you see Nimrod, you're introduced to his kingdom, which is Babel. And then not long afterwards, you're introduced to Assyria. So you have a whole bunch of stuff going on in Genesis chapter 10. But Nimrod, his name means rebellion, and his kingdom was Babel, so Babylon. So Nimrod and Babylon are closely associated, as well as Assyria. But it's interesting when you think about his kingdom, because the Bible can be separated into different categories and to try to make your mind, wrap your mind around it a little bit more simply. For example, in Genesis chapter 3, there are two seeds. There's the seed of the serpent, there's the and the seed of the woman. And then here you have Nimrod's kingdom, and then obviously there's a comparison with that. There is God's kingdom. Now, when you follow the thread or pull on the thread of Babylon, what you find is that it's ran by Gentiles. Nebuchadnezzar, he is the king of Babylon. And so that's an important detail to pay attention to. Because as you continue reading in Daniel chapter 7, you're introduced to four great beasts that come out of the sea. And you see the sea here. They come up out of the sea. And then he sees one that's a lion, one that's a bear, one that is like a leopard. And so this is Babylon, this is Persia, and this is Alexander the Great, so the Greeks. And then he sees a fourth beast, which he doesn't describe like an animal, but he describes it and he says it's dreadful and terrible. And he says that this one has 10 horns. Now, so going back to this part right here where you see four great beasts and how they came up out of the sea, this part right here where they came up out of the sea, I think is important to pay attention to. The sea can be seen as Gentile nations because each one of these four great beasts, the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the fourth one that was dreadful and terrible, they are all from Gentile nations. And so that is a key, that is something to pay attention to. And so when you pay attention to the four great beasts and you recognize what Daniel is given here in Daniel chapter 7, he's giving you and I a forecast of all of the nations that were going to follow Nebuchadnezzar, which was represented by the lion there. And these four great beasts basically reflect the Gentile dominion over the Jewish people. And so this is a phrase that we pull from in Luke 21 that Jesus uses. He says, Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. But I want you to pay attention to the times of the Gentiles, because the times of the Gentiles is very important to recognize, because what Jesus is saying is that there is a period of time where the Gentiles are going to be ruling over the Jewish people. And so the times of the Gentiles basically began with Nebuchadnezzar, and they are going to end with the Antichrist, in my opinion, because they are going to be ruled over until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So the Jewish people, if you're paying attention to our world right now and all of Jewish history, even though they're living in their own land, we are ruling over them. We are telling them what land they can have, what they can't have, what they can do, what they can't do. We are telling them, and that's just not how it's meant to be, and that's obviously going to change when Jesus returns. And so when Jesus returns, that will be the end of the times of the Gentiles, because Jesus is not a Gentile, Jesus is a Jew. And so when you just look at this phrase and you see how much is attached to this in their history, it's really, really instructive, because we learn that this seems to imply, just in these couple words right here, the time of the Gentiles, it seems to make it a little bit more clear that the Antichrist will also be Gentile, because when the time of the Gentiles is concluded, that means Jesus is back, and Jesus is a Jew. But a couple other examples. One is here in Micah chapter 5, verse 1. It says, "And this one," referring to Jesus, "this one, Jesus, shall be peace, And then he switches the topic a little bit. He says, when the Assyrian comes into our land and when he treads in our palaces, then we will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 princely men. They shall waste with the sword the land of Assyria and the land of Nimrod at its entrances. Thus he shall deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land, and when he treads within our borders. Then the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many peoples, like the dew from the Lord, like the showers of the grass that tarry for no man. And then it goes on here and it mentions the remnant of Jacob again. And that's an important concept to be familiar with too, because there's always going to be a remnant and we need to be sensitive to that. But what I want you to pay attention to here in Micah chapter 5 is it's referring to somebody as the Assyrian. Now, many people see the Assyrian as an allusion to the Antichrist, and I would agree with those people who see that. I think that this Assyrian is a foreshadow of the Antichrist. And so you see him being attached to the land of Nimrod. And if you remember going back to Genesis chapter 10, what we looked up right when this video started, the land of Nimrod is connected to Babylon. So the Assyrian, the Antichrist, I believe, is going to be in charge of the land of Nimrod, which is Babylon. So the Assyrian is going to be the king of Babylon. And that is important to recognize, because this, is all kind of tied together in Revelation chapter 18, if you guys remember that, because in Revelation 18, you and I are given the description of the fall of Babylon, because this Babylonian system that I believe is representing the entire earth is it's in full effect, and it's going to come to its final form during the 7 years of tribulation, which is gonna be crazy during that time. But Revelation chapter 18 is a picture of Babylon and its full form, and that Babylon is the land of Nimrod, and the Antichrist is going to be in charge of that entire system, and he's going to be calling the shots in many different arenas. And so that's pretty provocative. But I just want you to recognize the Assyrian is something to be mindful of, because this is mentioned, that title is mentioned all throughout Scripture. And another reason to piggyback off of the Assyrian is here in Isaiah chapter 14, where in Isaiah chapter 14, if you remember this chapter is speaking about the fall of Satan. You learn a lot about Lucifer in this chapter. And so when you recognize that, or you remember that Isaiah chapter 14 is largely about the Antichrist or Satan, then this verse kind of hits a little bit differently, because it says that I will break the Assyrian in my land. So here you have the Assyrian, the Antichrist, and he's going to be in God's land. Now, where's God's land? Israel, specifically Jerusalem. But it says I will break the Assyrian in my land, and on my mountains tread him underfoot. Now, why that's so interesting is because if you read a little bit more in Isaiah chapter 14, you find that this Antichrist seems to get literally trampled. And so it's really interesting diving into that topic, because it seems that he could possibly die during this, but he might be resurrected, which is really quite remarkable, because Satan is a counterfeit to Jesus. He's never had an original thought. And so when you look at Jesus and you recognize that Jesus is the first fruits of the first resurrection, which is found in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 20 through 23, and Jesus is the first fruits, and in Revelation chapter 20, I think it is, it talks about how blessed is he who takes part of the first resurrection. Well, when you think about the first resurrection and you flip it around to the second resurrection, it would be very fitting for the Assyrian to die and also to be resurrected, so that he could be the first fruits of the second resurrection. And so Jesus is the first fruits of the first resurrection, which would make a little sense to see Satan being the first fruits of the second resurrection, or the Antichrist. So the Antichrist seems to be the Assyrian, and he is going to be in Jerusalem, which is really provocative. Zechariah chapter 14, verse 1 and 2 basically talks about how half the city is going to be taken over. And so anyways, you see the Assyrian, you see the connection there. He's going to be in God's land, and he's going to be God is going to tread him underfoot. And if you remember, just summarizing really quick, if you remember what we talked about in Daniel chapter 7, how Daniel sees 4 beasts coming up out of the sea. Well, here in Revelation chapter 13, John mentions the sea, which again seems to speak of Gentiles, and he sees the beast rising up out of the sea. So this beast seems to be a Gentile that is going to be emerging at some point during the near future, in my opinion, if he's not already boots on the ground. Something to at least consider.